Have you ever heard of someone being forced to live as someone else, even taking the place of a dead empress? Imagine being at the center of the most powerful empire in the ancient world, being dressed, molded, exposed, not as you really are, but as someone who has already died. This is the story of Sporus, a story that blends pain, power, madness, and manipulation. And today you'll explore the dark underworld of Nero's palace, where not all who wore a crown had a choice about who they would be. By the way, before we continue this story that seems like a movie, but is real, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, leave that like, that helps me a lot to bring more stories like this. And comment below, have you ever heard of Spore? Let's go back in time to the heart of ancient Rome. Amid the decline of an empire rife with excess, war, and betrayal, there lived a young man named Sporus. Little is known about his exact origins. Some say he was a slave, others believe he had already been freed. But one thing all ancients agree on: he was extremely handsome, so handsome that he even caught the attention of Emperor Nero himself, one of the most controversial names in Roman history. But it wasn't just beauty. Sporus had delicate features, an appearance very reminiscent of a woman, and more specifically, he resembled Poppaea Sabina, Nero's wife, who had died shortly before tragically and violently. Nero, it is said, kicked her to death during a fight while she was still pregnant. After her death, the emperor spiraled into grief and madness. It was in this scenario of pain and delirium that Spore appeared. Nero looked at that young man and saw more than a person. He saw a chance to revive Poppaea, an almost theatrical, cruel, and symbolic substitution. Spore wasn't just brought to the palace, he was transformed, and that's where the story begins to delve into even darker territory. But before we get to the moment that changed Sporus's life forever, the brutal act that left his mark, you need to understand how Nero decided that this young man would be more than just a favorite of the emperor. He would be his new wife, and that's what I'm going to tell you now. The relationship between Sporus and Nero was not a love story. Far from it. It was a relationship of power, of obsession, and absolute imposition. When Nero lost Poppaea, he didn't seek solace, he sought a perfect replacement, and Sporus, with her youthful face and delicate features, became the ideal target of the emperor's fantasy. But the most shocking thing was yet to come. Nero didn't just bring Sporus into the palace, he married him. Yes, you heard that right. Nero held a public ceremony, with guests, priests, and all the pomp required for an imperial wedding. Sporus was dressed in a bridal veil, as if she were a traditional Roman bride. The emperor called her my wife, addressed her as empress, and demanded that others do the same. It was no spectacle hidden in the shadows, it was a scandal in the open, shown to the people and the Roman elite. And Spore, he was young, very young. He had no choice. It was like a play he was forced to perform to satisfy the whims of a man who ruled with a mixture of vanity and cruelty. Imagine being a teenager ripped from your life, physically mutilated, and forced to play a role that wasn't yours, before an entire empire. Ancient sources described this relationship with a tone of horror, scandal, and criticism. Sporus was not a partner. He was a living projection of what Nero had lost. To the emperor, he was the new Poppaea. To everyone else, he was a living representation of Rome's moral decay. And all this wasn't just symbolic. Nero demanded that Sporus accompany him to official events, banquets, and festivals. Always dressed as a woman, always at the emperor's side, he was called empress, but without ever having been one, not by choice, but by imposition. And as bizarre as this story already seems, the darkest part was yet to come. Because before all this happened, in order for Spore to fit perfectly into the emperor's fantasy, something terrible was done to him. Now hold on tight, because what comes next isn't easy to hear, but it's necessary to understand the brutality that surrounded Spore's life. Before the wedding, before the public parades, before the empress's robes, Nero made an irreversible decision. He had Sporus castrated. Yes, he was just a young man, perhaps not even out of his teens, when he was subjected to this brutal mutilation. The goal, to make his voice higher pitched, his body more delicate, his face more feminine. It was as if the emperor were trying to rebuild Poppaea from scratch, using someone else's body. But this was not done with care or dignity. We are talking about 1st century Rome, where this type of procedure was performed cruelly, without anesthesia, without hygiene, and without any consent. Sporus lost something more than his physical identity. He lost the right to be himself. He was forcibly molded, as if he were a living statue sculpted to please the emperor. Castration wasn't an end in itself, it was just the beginning. From then on, Nero began training Sporus to live as a woman. He dressed him in women's clothing, forced him to act delicately, and walked like a court lady. And all this was done before the eyes of the Roman elite, who amidst whispers and laughter, watched from the box seats as the emperor staged the tragic play. And again, it's important to remember, Spore didn't choose any of this. He was a victim of a system where the emperor's will was absolute command, and if Nero wanted to make a boy his wife, Rome obeyed, even if it meant sacrificing an entire life for the sake of one man's folly. But Nero's obsession didn't stop there. He didn't just want Spore to look like Poppaea. He wanted Spore to be Poppaea in everything. Now just imagine living in the shadow of someone who's already dead, being constantly compared, measured, forced to imitate every gesture, every feature, every look. That was Spore's reality. Nero's obsession with Poppaea Sabina was unhealthy. She was considered one of the most beautiful women of her time, and Nero loved her in a twisted, possessive and violent way. So violent that in a fit of rage, he kicked her to death, even though she was pregnant. But when Poppaea died, Nero couldn't get over it. He wanted to bring her back, and that's exactly what he tried to do with Sporus. Contemporary sources claim that Sporus bore a frightening resemblance to Poppaea. The same delicate features, the same fair skin, the same gentle expression. It was as if fate had placed before Nero a reflection of his deceased wife. But this reflection was a real, named living human being, one who was gradually erased to fuel the emperor's illusion. And the more Nero saw Poppaea in Sporus, the more demanding he became. He ordered him to wear the same jewelry, the same hairstyles. He wanted him to speak with the same tone of voice. He even took him on official trips, as if he were a living reincarnation of the woman he had lost. The entire empire watched in shock, unsure whether this was an act or a dangerous delusion. But think about it. What did this do to Spore's mind? What was it like to live every day as a mirror of someone dead, while his own self disappeared? The truth is, Spore was no longer seen as a person. To Nero, he was a piece of paper, a handsome ghost with a new body. And the people? The Roman aristocracy. Everyone watched this spectacle silently, some with fear, others with contempt. But no one dared confront the emperor, even with such bizarre events unfolding before their eyes. But Nero wasn't discreet. On the contrary, he showed Sporus off to the world, and made sure to make it clear who his new empress was. Now imagine the scene. The streets of Rome are packed, crowds gathered to watch the emperor pass by. Trumpets are blaring, soldiers are leading the way, and at the center of the procession, next to Nero, is Sporus. Not as an advisor, not as a guard, not as just any young man, but dressed in veils, jewels, and silk robes, like the Empress of Rome. Yes, Nero made a point of displaying Sporus at public ceremonies, imperial banquets, theatrical performances, and even religious events. He hid nothing. Sporus was treated as an official figure at court, entitled to a place of honor, ceremonial titles, and public reverence. The only difference, he didn't choose to be there. While the other nobles came with their real wives, Nero appeared with Sporus hand in hand as a couple. It was a performance of the utmost bizarreness, an affront to the moral standards of the time, but no one dared laugh out loud or comment openly, because laughing at Sporus was laughing at Nero, and laughing at Nero could cost one's life. But people were talking, of course. On street corners, in markets, in tavern alleys, people whispered about that tragic figure, the young man forced to be a feminine shadow, walking among senators and generals with a practiced smile and practiced steps. Some mocked, others pitied, but no one ignored it. And the cruelest thing is that, behind that spectacle of gold and silk, was someone who had been mutilated, silenced, erased, but who still had to play the role of wife, empress, muse. Sporus wasn't just a personal victim. He had become the living symbol of Nero's absolute power, capable of shaping reality to his will. Did he want a new marriage? He did. Did he want a new Poppaea? He created one. Did he want an artificial empress? He paraded her around before everyone. And the more Sporus was exposed, the more criticism of Rome's decadence grew. Not directly, but between the lines, in whispers, in the glances exchanged during banquets. But while Sporus was being treated like a wife by the most powerful man in the world, the entire empire began to shake from within. And her figure, which had previously caused only scandal, now became a reflection of the Roman collapse itself. Have you ever stopped to think about what a story like this would do to the people of a city? How would a society, an entire nation, react to seeing the emperor not only act so erratically, but also impose this madness on his subjects? Rome's reaction to this bizarre union between Nero and Sporus was mixed, but equally revealing. On the one hand, there were those who despised and openly criticized the emperor's behavior. Rome, despite being known for its grandeur and excesses, still had strong morals, and Nero's behavior was pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable. He not only manipulated Sporus's life but also forced Roman society to accept it as normal. The scandal spread like wildfire. At banquets, in the squares, in informal conversations, people talked about it. How could Rome accept an emperor who used his power so absurdly, transforming a young man into something he didn't want to be? Sporus, even as a victim of all this, also became a symbol of the empire's moral decay. His figure was seen by many as a reflection of an emperor who had completely lost control of himself, someone who was increasingly distancing himself from Roman traditions, honor, and dignity. But there were also those who feared Nero. The Roman Empire was a place where the absolute power of the emperors often led to tyranny. Rebellions were crushed, treason was punished with terrible deaths, and the fear of falling victim to Nero was a constant reality. Therefore, many Romans, especially members of the elite, preferred to remain silent. They saw what was happening to Sporus, but they feared Nero's reaction more than the pain of a young man being subjugated and transformed against his will. The Roman elite knew that disobeying or criticizing Nero could mean the end of their career or their lives. And so, Sporus became the center of a silent tragedy. As he fulfilled his role as empress, Roman society began to divide between those who saw it as a reflection of the emperor's madness and those who silently tried to cope with the reality of an empire about to disintegrate under the weight of tyranny. Despite the laughter and murmuring in the corners, the truth was that no one dared to confront Nero's power directly. What Sporus was experiencing was a reflection of the fear that gripped Rome. But what Sporus didn't know, or perhaps he knew all too well, was that his story was about to become even more tragic. His transformation into a public figure not only stripped him of his humanity, but also put him in the crosshairs of something even more dangerous: the end of Nero himself. Nero's death in 68 AD marked a milestone that not only ended the reign of one of the most infamous emperors in Roman history, but also ushered in a new chapter in Sporus's life. With Nero's fall, Rome entered a turbulent period known as the Year of the Four Emperors, where the struggle for the throne became a constant. The empire was in chaos, and Sporus, who until then had been a puppet in Nero's hands, now found himself without the emperor's protection. The transition was not smooth. Sporus, who had already been forced to submit to so much, no longer had the support of Nero, who had placed him in a privileged position. Now, he was at the mercy of the new emperors who rose to power and the forces vying for control of the empire. First, he was inherited by Otho, one of the emperors who passed through the throne during this chaotic period. And Otho, much like Nero, treated Sporus as his wife, in an attempt to continue the grotesque spectacle Nero had begun. Otho also seemed to see Sporus as a figure of worship, but once again, the young man had no control over his life. However, Sporus's luck would not last long under Otho. The Roman Empire was at war, and disputes between imperial factions were intense. Otho was defeated by Vitellius, another emperor of the period of instability, and with the shift in power, Sporus found himself once again at the mercy of new rulers. Sporus's life became increasingly vulnerable. Now, without Nero's protection or the symbolic status of an imperial wife, he was treated as a war trophy, something to be possessed and discarded at the new emperor's whim. According to some historical sources, Sporus was forced to commit suicide or was killed on Vitellius's orders to avoid any further public humiliation. Sporus' death, like his life, was tragic and senseless. He was a figure used by others for their own ends, a symbol of absolute power and control, and unlike the opulence that surrounded him in his youth, he ended his life alone and silently. But even with the end of his life, Sporus' story did not fade. He became a symbol of oppression, the manipulation of power, the loss of identity, and control over one's own destiny. His name echoed through the centuries, not only as a figure in Roman history, but also as a bitter reminder of how the empire, and any empire, can use and destroy lives to sustain its own fantasies. And although Sporus' life was marked by suffering and manipulation, something interesting happened over time. His name and story were not forgotten. Sporus became a powerful symbol not only of Nero's decline but also of the absurdity of absolute power and the exploitation of individuals for political and personal gain. Over the centuries, Sporus has been portrayed in different ways, not only as a victim, but as a symbol of human vulnerability in the face of empire. His story appears in numerous historical and literary works. Philosophers, writers, and historians have used his example to discuss the role of victims in the power struggles of great empires, and how an individual's life could be manipulated to please a ruler. Sporus was no longer just the young man Nero used to fulfill a fantasy. He became a reflection of the cruelty that often accompanies absolute power. In popular culture, his figure has been revived as part of the debate about identity and the limits of control over the body and mind. Many contemporary historians, especially those who study gender and identity, view Sporus and his relationship with Nero as one of the first trans narratives in history. He was undoubtedly one of the first victims of an identity imposition, but also one of the first figures who, by being molded against his will, became a symbol of the empire's power over the human body. But Sporus' story goes beyond history books. It also enters conversations about freedom and choice. To what extent can and should society influence or even force individuals to conform to arbitrary expectations? Sporus became a tragic example of this struggle, of how the desires of one man, in this case Nero, can be imposed on others, transforming their lives into puppets and characters in a power struggle. And while Sporus' story was used as a metaphor to reflect on the injustices of the past, it also became a framework for questioning what we are willing to accept in our own lives. The questions he raised about identity, control, and oppression still resonate today. His life, though cruel and twisted, remains a warning about the limits of power and the importance of fighting for our freedom and identity. Now you might be wondering, what can we really learn from all this? How does Sporus' tragedy connect to the modern world? This reflection leads us to understand how power can distort reality and manipulate people's lives, often without their having a voice or choice. But it also reminds us of the importance of preserving our identity, our dignity, and our freedom. And with that, Sporus' story, while painful and dark, offers valuable lessons about how history always has something to teach us, even in the darkest moments. When we look at Sporus' story, it can be hard to imagine how a figure from ancient Rome can still teach us anything today. After all, we're talking about an empire that fell centuries ago. But if we dig deep enough, we'll realize that, in some ways, Sporus' story reflects issues we still face today. In the modern world, the manipulation of body and identity still affects many people. What happened to Sporus is a metaphor for a society that often tries to mold and control people according to standards not chosen by them. This can be seen in issues of gender, identity, sexuality, and even in how people deal with external social pressures. Sporus' story isn't just about a man forcibly molded by the whims of an eccentric emperor. It also touches on a universal theme: how personal identity can be distorted by society and power. How many times throughout history have individuals been forced to change who they were, or behave in ways that didn't reflect their true essence, all to please or submit to the will of a higher authority? Sporus, in his pain and suffering, became a figure who represents the danger of losing oneself within the expectations imposed by others. What Nero did to Sporus is a representation of how the history of an empire can be defined by the will of one person or a class of people over the life of another human being. In the modern world, we can still see how this dynamic is reflected in more subtle forms of social control, whether through institutions, political systems, or even in the pressures of everyday life. In the current scenario, there is a parallel with the way in which image and body are manipulated on social media. And in popular culture, how many of us have found ourselves trying to conform to a standard of beauty or an expectation created by others, without room to be who we truly are? Just as Nero used spore to create his own version of an empress, today's world often demands that we mold ourselves to fit a standard we didn't choose. Social media, for example, makes people feel pressured to present an edited version of themselves, often to please an audience or a collective ideal. This resonates with what Spore experienced in his life, a life forced to be a representation, a mask of something he never chose to be. He became a reflection of someone else's desires. Another crucial aspect of Sporus's story is the question of gender and identity. Although Roman society was extremely rigid in terms of gender roles, Sporus's story leads us to question what happens when someone has no control over their identity, be it gender, sexual orientation, or any other fundamental aspect of who they are. The issue of autonomy over one's own body and the struggle for identity recognition are still very present topics in the contemporary world, with the growing movement for LGBTQIA+ rights and the struggle of trans people to have their rights and identities recognized. Spore's story, with his castration and forced transformation, can be seen as a kind of warning about the dangers of stripping a human being of their autonomy, something that, unfortunately, many people still face today, whether due to social, cultural, or political impositions. As we reflect on Sporus's life and the ways he was exploited by the powerful of his time, we cannot help but notice the importance of studying these historical figures, even if their stories aren't the most glorious. When we think of ancient Rome, we usually think of great battles, conquering empires, and powerful kings. But what lies behind these grandiose narratives is the suffering of ordinary people, like Sporus. And this leads us to a deeper reflection on the role of history in education. Often, when we learn about the great civilizations of the past, we are captivated by stories of conquest, wealth, and power. However, Sporus's story shows us that not all stories of empires are built on heroic deeds or great military victories. Some stories, like his, are marked by abuses of power, personal tragedies, and the struggles of individuals who were denied a voice. When we study figures like Sporus, we're not just learning about ancient Rome, we're learning about the human struggle against the abuse of power. We're observing how one individual's control over another can extend beyond wars and politics, and into their very lives, identities, and bodies. And this is relevant to any society at any time. It doesn't matter if we're talking about the Roman Empire or the modern world. The struggle for the freedom to be who we truly are is timeless. Furthermore, Spore's story also serves to challenge traditional narratives. It's easy to look at powerful figures in history and see only the heroes or villains of the narrative. But what about the people who were left out, whose voices were silenced? Who were they? What did they suffer? What can we learn from their lives? Studying stories like Spore's also teaches us the importance of empathy. By looking at history's darkest moments, we can better understand the suffering of others and recognize past mistakes so we don't repeat them. Understanding history helps us understand power dynamics and question the ways in which, even today, some people continue to be manipulated, marginalized, and abused. But how do we know all this? How can a figure like Sporus, who lived almost 2,000 years ago, still be remembered today in such detail? The answer lies in ancient historical sources, accounts written by chroniclers, historians, and senators of the time that documented the most significant events of the Roman Empire. Interestingly, although Sporus was never officially a political figure, his name appears in the works of three of the greatest Roman historians, Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio. Let's start with Suetonius, author of the Lives of the 12 Caesars. He was known for his direct language and his focus on curiosities, scandals, and intimate details of the emperor's lives. He detailed Nero's marriage to Sporus, and described how the emperor treated him as a wife, even calling him Sabina, a reference to the late Poppaea. Suetonius was the first to report the case openly, almost as a warning about the kind of tyranny Rome had allowed to flourish. Then we have Tacitus, a more political and reflective author. In his annals, he narrates the excesses of Nero's rule with a critical but also cautious tone. Tacitus saw Nero as a symbol of moral corruption and institutional decay, and used the episode of Sporus as an example of how power can corrupt even the barest limits of decency. He didn't provide many details about Sporus, but he made it clear how much this marriage scandalized the senatorial elite of the time. And finally, we have Cassius Dio, a Greek historian who wrote in Greek but lived under the Roman Empire. In his monumental work, Roman History, he describes Sporus as a boy whom Nero castrated and married off as a woman, living with him as his wife. Cassius Dio's narration of the case is a mixture of astonishment and contempt. He seems incredulous that something so absurd could have been permitted by the Senate and Roman society. These three authors did not write with empathy for Sporus. It's important to make this clear: they were not concerned with his pain, his identity, or his autonomy. Sporus was, for them, a symbol of Nero's madness, and their words served more as a critique of the emperor than a defense of the castrated young man. Yet it was through them that the modern world learned of Sporus's story. And that is one of the saddest ironies of this narrative. Sporus' story survives not because of who he was, but because of who destroyed him. But despite this, what we have today is a chance to reinterpret their history in a different light, with empathy, understanding, and the care their contemporaries lacked. And that's precisely why in the next episode, we'll delve into a question that has intrigued modern historians for centuries. Can Sporus be considered one of the first trans figures in history, or was he simply a victim of circumstance? The answer, like everything in history, may be much more complex than it seems. Stay with me, because it will open a powerful debate about identity, choice, and the right to exist. Now that we know what historians of the time recorded about Sporus, it's time to raise one of the most debated questions of recent times. Can Sporus be considered a trans figure in ancient history? Or are we simply dealing with a victim of imperial abuse? This is a question that divides scholars, and it's important to begin by saying that we need to be careful when applying modern labels to people who lived 2,000 years ago. Roman society didn't have the same concepts of gender identity that we have today. Terms like man, woman, non-binary, or trans simply didn't exist back then, as they do today. But that doesn't mean that issues of gender identity, body, and representation weren't present. They were, very much so. Sporus was forcibly castrated, dressed as a woman, called his wife, and publicly paraded as an empress. But all of this was done without his consent. He did not choose this life. There is no record that Sporus identified as a woman, nor that he desired to live under that identity. All we know is that Nero wanted to recreate Poppaea and molded Sporus to do so. Therefore, many scholars consider Sporus a victim of gender-based violence, but not necessarily a trans person. He didn't transition voluntarily. He didn't claim an identity. He was forced to play a role, an emperor's fantasy, and that changes everything. On the other hand, some hypothesize that we may not know everything. After all, Sporus's story was told only by elite men who saw everything through the eyes of Roman morality. None of these historians bothered to understand what Sporus felt, who he was inside. Did he, at some point, recognize himself in that imposed identity? Did he try to survive by creating meaning in the role he was forced to live? These are questions for which we will never have a definitive answer, but which open up space for reflection. The most important thing here is to understand how much Sporus' story still teaches us about contemporary discussions. He was the target of institutional violence, his body manipulated, his identity erased, and his existence turned into a spectacle. These themes, unfortunately, are still very present in our society today, especially when we talk about trans and gender non-conforming people. Ultimately, Sporus became a tragic symbol of the struggle for autonomy. His story reminds us that identity shouldn't be imposed. It should be discovered, respected, and protected. And that's why, in the next chapter, we'll delve into one of the most cruel and symbolic details of this story. The very name Sporus bore, a name that seemed to have been chosen as a bad joke. Spore, which in Greek means seed, and that seed, in Nero's mouth, said more than words can express. Now that we understand a little more about Sporus's life, one last symbolic question arises. His name, Sporus, which in Greek means seed. Why did Nero, in his wickedness, choose this name for the young man he would use as his replacement for Poppaea? Herein lies one of the most bitter ironies of this story. The name Spore is a term associated with life potential, growth and fertility. In other words, it represents the ability to generate new life, to create something new. But in the context of Spor's life, this name was completely inverted. Instead of being the seed of a new beginning, Spore became the seed of a tragedy, of a cruel human experiment that instead of fertilizing his identity or his freedom, only destroyed everything he could be as an individual. To Nero, Sporus was not a real person. He was a figure to be molded and discarded at will. By giving him this name, Nero perhaps meant to symbolize the idea of planting a new version of Poppy. But ironically, the name seed makes Sporus's entire narrative even darker. He was manipulated and controlled in such an extreme way that, instead of growing and flourishing as any young man should, he was pruned and altered. He became something that had no life of its own, but existed to give a sense of continuity to the desires of a powerful man. This name also connects with Nero's utter disregard for Spore's individuality. By choosing a name that evokes a seed, something small, fragile, and meant to be planted and used, Nero shows how he viewed Spore as an object, as a tool to serve his own needs, something to be discarded when no longer needed. And the irony doesn't stop there. The name Spore is a reminder of how the Roman Empire, in its relentless pursuit of power, exploited the lives of individuals without any regard for their humanity. Instead of a life full of possibilities, Spore had his very identity stolen and was reduced to a mere instrument of Nero's pleasure and control. This seed metaphor also resonates with humanity's biggest questions. What does it take for us to grow and flourish as individuals? What are the external forces that try to shape us, prune us, and transform us into something we are not? Now it's impossible not to wonder how many people throughout history and even today have been treated the same way as Spore. How many times have lives been shaped and disfigured by power, oppression, and the manipulation of individuals who didn't see the humanity in others? Spore, the young man who was called Seed, ended up being the seed of the very end of his freedom. He was used, destroyed, and ultimately forgotten. His name echoes the tragedy of a life without choice, without autonomy, without hope. Now, as we reflect on all this, you might ask, how can we ensure that stories like Spore's don't happen again? How can we build a future where power doesn't destroy a person's individuality, freedom, and dignity? So far, we've talked a lot about Sporus, his pain, his forced role, his unwilling transformation. But now it's time to step back and look at the bigger picture. What does Sporus's story reveal about the soul of the Roman Empire? What does it tell us about how the power behind the marble columns and red robes worked? And the answer is simple yet profound. Sporus's story exposes the Roman Empire naked, without glory, without heroism, without facade. It shows that, behind the discourses of order, civilization, and progress, lay a brutal system where the desire of a single man could be worth more than the life, identity, and dignity of another human being. And we're not talking about just any man. Nero was the emperor, the center of everything. When he decided that Sporus would be his wife, there were no laws to stop him, there were no councils to question him. The Senate, supposedly a powerful institution, simply what? The Roman elite, which so valued honor and virility, remained silent. Why? Because fear dominated Rome. Absolute power had ceased to be an idea and had become a real monster, capable of objectifying anyone, like Sporus. This shows us a harsh truth. The Roman Empire, for all its architectural splendor and military conquests, was also a place where cruelty was institutionalized, where human beings were disposable, and where the pain of individuals was invisible beneath the glitter of the crown. Spore's story dismantles the myth that the empire was merely a land of order and grandeur. It shows that the gears of this power were driven by fear, violence, and silence, and the scariest part. This closely resembles power dynamics we see today, in authoritarian governments, in abusive relationships, in structures that dehumanize others to maintain order. Therefore, Sporus is not only a symbol of Nero's decline, he is a portrait of history's silent victims, those who had no voice, who appear neither in statues nor monuments, but who lived and suffered under the shadow of empires built upon their backs. And that's why telling stories like this matters so much. Because when we understand the past honestly, we can better see the present. And who knows, even prevent mistakes from happening again. We've reached the end of this journey. And perhaps you're sitting there silently, digesting everything you've just heard. Understandably so. Spor's story isn't easy to hear, nor to forget, but it carries a power few stories possess. The power to transform us. And the final question is this: what can we learn from Spor? The first great lesson is about the danger of unlimited power. Nero wasn't just an eccentric tyrant, he was the reflection of a system that allowed one man to place himself above all others. A system where the emperor's will was stronger than the law, morality, and even the lives of others. Sporus was crushed by this system. His story reminds us that when power becomes absolute, it ceases to protect and begins to destroy. The second lesson is about identity. Spor shows us what happens when someone is prevented from being who they are. They've been molded, cut, disguised, and displayed, but not by choice, by imposition. And this leads us to reflect how many people today still live hidden behind imposed masks. How many are still silenced, forced into roles they didn't choose, simply to meet society's expectations. The third, perhaps the most important, is about memory. Spor could have been forgotten. He could have been just another name lost in the pages of an old book. But today, by telling his story with empathy and sensitivity, we rescue him from the shadows. We give him something he never had in life: a voice. By telling Spor's story, we are telling the world that no life is too small to be remembered, that even those who lived without choice deserve to be remembered with respect. And finally, Spor teaches us something fundamental. History is not made only by the victors, nor by kings and generals. It is also made by those who have been silenced, oppressed, and forgotten. They too have a story, and perhaps it is the most important one to tell. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched you in some way. And if it did, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Talk about it. Show someone who needs to understand how much the past can teach us about empathy, justice, and dignity. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and activate the bell. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we give voice to what history tried to silence. And tell me here in the comments, what marked you most in the history of Spor? Do you think that nowadays we really learn from the mistakes of the past? Thank you for sticking with me until the end. See you in the next video, with more stories of kings, queens, sovereigns, and also of those who never held a throne but deserve to be remembered. See you then.